There is a type of person who enters your life with a wound that seems authentic, a story that seems urgent, a silent plea for help that seems impossible to ignore. You believe that if you give enough love, if you listen with enough patience, if you sacrifice a little more of yourself, they will finally wake up. But Carl Jung understood something most people don't have the courage to face. Certain people are not looking for someone to heal them. They are looking for someone who accepts being the receptacle of the pain they refuse to look at. And the most disturbing thing is that you were taught to call this love. You are not exhausted because you love too much. You are exhausted because you assumed, without realizing it, the psychological role that this person refuses to exercise. They don't need to change as long as there is someone willing to suffer in their place. And here is where the Jungian inversion begins to burn. The problem was never a lack of love on your part. The problem was that your love became fuel for the other's inertia. This video is about the people you should never have tried to save, and about the invisible price you pay for continuing to try. There is a silent moment, almost invisible, when someone stops giving. It is not an announced decision. It does not come with a speech, a farewell, an elegant explanation. It is merely an internal withdrawal, almost imperceptible to the other, and devastating inside. On the outside, those who always received see only coldness. They call this new version distant, selfish, changed. They cannot see that what they interpret as cruelty is, in fact, the first breath of lucidity from someone who spent years emotionally supporting a relationship where only one side carried the weight. You know that moment. It is when you realize that the call you were about to answer has become an obligation, when the message that once made you happy began to drain you, when you understood that your patience was not virtue, it was a psychological contract signed in silence in which you agreed to endure in exchange for being loved. And the darkest thing is that no one notices this moment happening, neither those who exploit, nor often even yourself. It is only noticed afterward, when exhaustion speaks louder than guilt. It is not coldness, it is recognition. It is not abandonment, it is weaning. It is not cruelty, it is the end of the theater in which you acted as an inexhaustible source for someone who treated you as a resource. Jung said that most human suffering is the refusal to see what we have known for a long time. And when that veil falls, what remains is not anger. It is a lucid and surgical pain. The pain of realizing that what you called love was, in many cases, a sophisticated form of emotional submission. You were not loving, you were maintaining, you were sustaining. You were carrying someone who settled on your shoulders because they discovered early on that your shoulders never complained. And here psychology becomes relentless. Certain people do not choose whom to love. They choose who endures. They do not do this with conscious malice, and that is exactly what makes the pattern so hard to identify. There is an unconscious radar, almost animal-like, that detects in another human being the willingness to absorb. A radar that sniffs out who feels guilty for saying no, who confuses usefulness with identity, who was trained from an early age to believe that being loved is a direct consequence of being useful. It is no coincidence that the same types of people keep appearing in your life. It's not bad luck, it's structure. You emit a psychological frequency of infinite availability, and the world, cruelly practical, sends you exactly what that frequency invites. Friends who only call when they're drowning, family members who only remember your name when they need something, partners who mistake your stability for a waiver of their own emotional responsibility. You have become the emotional adult of a circle of people who refuse to grow up, and every gesture of generosity on your part has functioned as a license for them to remain exactly where they are. Generosity without limits does not produce gratitude, it produces dependence. And dependence, in no time, disguises itself as a bond. When you start pulling away, the other person doesn't feel longing. They feel the absence of a service. They don't feel the loss of your soul, they feel the loss of your support. And that's why the most common accusation against someone who begins to set boundaries is that they have changed. You didn't change, you awoke. And waking up, for those who benefited from your sleep, is always betrayal. That is why I prepared O Código do Despertar for you. If you have come this far, and are feeling that quiet discomfort, that visceral recognition that you spent years supporting people who would never support you back, that signal is not weakness. It is the beginning of individuation. O Código do Despertar is a 60-day inner map built on the psychology of Carl Jung, one lesson per day with keys, questions, and declarations that will pull you out of paralysis and return your center. You read, do the micro-action, write in your journal, and feel the change happening inside. The guide is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you already understand that you need to begin this crossing, write a single word in the comments, awoke. This symbolic commitment is the first step for you to stop being a deposit and become the subject of your own life again. There is a silent part in all of us that resists, until the very last moment, accepting what the body already knows. And the body, that honest translator of the unconscious, starts signaling long before consciousness does. It's the insomnia after that conversation. It's the tension in your jaw when her name appears on the screen. It's the slight nausea before a family dinner. The organism, wiser than the mind trained to please, begins to refuse what the soul sustains out of obligation. And when you ignore these signals, they do not disappear, they accumulate. They turn into chronic fatigue, into inexplicable irritation, into a sadness without an address. Here we enter the most uncomfortable territory of Jungian psychology, the mask. The persona is that carefully constructed version of yourself designed to fit the molds that guarantee acceptance. It's not malice, it's survival. While still young, you learned which parts of you were welcomed and which were silenced, ridiculed, punished. And so you edited yourself. You hid the anger, swallowed the disagreement, disguised the boundary, smiled when you wanted to scream. Over time, the mask stuck so firmly that you forgot the face behind it. The exhaustion you feel after being around certain people is not physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself to keep others comfortable. The problem is that the persona is not yours alone. Others use theirs too. And certain people have built such efficient masks that they have become literally incapable of seeing their own selfishness. They aren't pretending. They truly believe they are generous, attentive, loving, even when the practical evidence of their behavior screams the opposite. That is why confronting these people rarely works. You are not speaking to a conscious adult. You are speaking to a mask that needs to stay intact so that the entire edifice of their identity does not collapse. And that's where the shadow comes in. Everything a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves, selfishness, manipulation, envy, emotional incompetence, doesn't disappear. Buried things don't die, they leak. They stay stored in the shadow, silent and patient, and find a way out through the front door of someone else's consciousness. Projection. That's why when you start pulling away, you get called selfish by someone who has been selfish with you your whole life. That's why whoever never prioritized anyone accuses you of prioritizing yourself too much. It's not irony. It's pure psychology. The person isn't lying. They are using you as a screen to project what they refuse to see inside themselves. You aren't cold. You became the mirror. And most people hurt those who refuse to distort their own reflection. That's why change is never well received by those who benefited from your stagnation. Whoever grows alone grows against the family that preferred you predictable, against the friendship that fed on your self-erasure, against the partner who mistook your silence for peace. There is a dangerous illusion that sustains unbalanced relationships for decades, the hope that one big fight, one decisive confrontation, one revealing conversation will finally open the other person's eyes. You wait for the cinematic moment of change. But real change almost never arrives that way. It arrives in silence through the side door of exhaustion. It isn't the scream that changes everything. It's the accumulated fatigue of always making excuses. It's the day you look back and realize how many times you crafted elegant explanations for someone's unacceptable behavior. You invented reasons. He's going through a hard time. She's always been like that, it's just her way. His childhood was complicated. She didn't have good examples at home. Those sentences weren't understanding. They were psychological crutches you built to avoid facing the harshest truth. Some people aren't confused. They aren't lost. They aren't blocked. They simply found, in you, such an efficient system of absorption that they never had to face the consequences of themselves. And that's what Jung would call individuation born through the wound, the moment when the excuse stops serving you. The moment you realize that infinite patience wasn't a virtue, it was anesthesia. You weren't forgiving, you were postponing, you weren't understanding, you were avoiding. And when the anesthesia wears off, what's left is a pain so precise that it becomes information. The pain shows you, with no room for negotiation, that people change when they want to, not when you want them to. No one carries anyone else into their own consciousness. Each person only enters there on their own 2 feet. And it is at this exact point, when the last excuse falls to the ground, that o código do despertar becomes urgent. You cannot cross this crossing alone, groping in the dark, hoping to find the way by accident. The guide is in the first pinned comment, with 60 days of inner map, 1 lesson per day so you won't retreat. The decision must be made today. Tomorrow, the mask will glue itself back on. No one goes back to the same place after seeing. That's why many people prefer not to see. That's why most people choose comfortable ignorance over painful awareness. But you, who are here, listening to this until this point, have already crossed an invisible line. Ignorance is no longer an option. You already know, and what is known cannot be unknown. The moment arrives when the only way out presents itself, the boundary. And here lies one of the quietest pains of individuation. For those who built their identity on usefulness, saying no feels like a small death. Every time you refuse a request, something inside you whispers that you are being selfish, cruel, unnatural. That whisper is not your conscience. It is the echo of an old programming installed by voices that needed your eternal availability to survive. Setting a boundary is not about building walls. It is about finally recognizing that you are a person before you are a service, that your emotional resources are finite, that your peace is not a negotiable byproduct of others' comfort. The integration of the shadow in this context has a very precise meaning. It is accepting that within you lies the capacity to disappoint others, and that this capacity is not a flaw. It is proof that you exist as an individual and not as an extension. You need to understand something cold and liberating at the same time. Disappointing people who only fed on your surrender is not a character flaw. It is a sign of psychic maturity. Whoever demands that you never disappoint anyone is, in practice, demanding that you never truly exist. Because truly existing is having a shape, and having a shape is, inevitably, bumping into someone who preferred you formless. Not because you got worse, but because you stopped being useful in the old form. Not because you hardened, but because you finally stopped bending until you broke. And people, especially those who mistook your lack of boundaries for kindness, will react as if you had committed a crime. You didn't. You merely recovered from a state of emotional servitude in which you mistook your own erasure for virtue. The interesting thing is that on the other side of this discomfort, there is a new breath, an unexpected lightness. The energy you once spent fabricating explanations, postponing confrontations, and sustaining falsehoods begins to flow back inward. And the body thanks you before the mind does. You start sleeping better, eating with more pleasure, listening to a song and truly feeling it. It is the organism rediscovering its own rhythm after years of syncing with the urgency of others. But here arises a resistance that must be clearly named, the idea that history guarantees access, that shared time is a perpetual debt, that blood is a contract, that old friendship is a lifetime pass to your patience. None of this is true, and pretending it is has been what kept you trapped for so long. Sharing history with someone only means that you occupied the same space-time. It does not mean that person deserves to remain in your life through every new version of yourself you become. People change. You change. And some relationships only worked because you were an earlier version of yourself. A more bendable, quieter, more approval-hungry version. Maintaining those bonds out of chronological loyalty is a sophisticated form of cruelty toward yourself. Family is not justification for recurring disrespect. Old friendship is not a passport to emotional abuse disguised as intimacy. A long-term partnership is not a license for someone to mistake your tolerance for an irrevocable contract. What grants access to your life is not the past, It is consistent behavior in the present, that's it. And once that criterion takes effect, many things that seemed sacred begin to show their own skeleton. Some bonds will survive this sieve. They will surprise you. People you thought were distant will prove closer than the supposed intimates, and other bonds will crumble to dust, showing they were never made of love, but of convenience. That is not a tragedy, it is a revelation. Better to lose an illusion than to sustain a prison. And this is precisely where your responsibility becomes non-transferable. No one is going to make this crossing for you. No book you've merely read will replace daily practice. No inspired line from a post will reconfigure the pattern that has settled in over decades. The Código do Despertar exists for exactly this, to transform awareness into routine. 60 days, one lesson at a time, with keys, questions, and declarations that force you to act. The guide is in the first pinned comment. You can keep promising yourself that someday you'll change, or you can start today, now, before the mask adjusts itself back over your face. The choice is yours, but whoever chooses to delay has already chosen to remain exactly where they are. Only there is one last pain, perhaps the most silent of all, waiting for you at the end of this path. It is the pain of mourning. Not mourning for someone who is gone, but mourning for who you were. For all the versions of yourself you sacrificed, trying to remain acceptable. For the child who learned that love is earned through usefulness. For the teenager who fell silent to avoid losing affection. For the adult who spent years performing a calm they did not feel, so as not to disappoint those who never had the courage to truly look inward. There is a specific sadness when you realize how many years you spent trying to be enough for people who were never going to be satisfied. How many conversations you rehearsed in your head, trying to explain more gently something that shouldn't need explaining. How many nights you spent rearranging feelings that the other person refused to consider. That time doesn't come back. And part of maturing is accepting that it was spent. Not wasted. Spent. Because it was that time, exactly that time, that brought you to this point of clarity. You haven't lost the ability to love. You've just stopped confusing love with silent sacrifice, with voluntary invisibility, with the compulsion to fix what was never yours to fix. Real love doesn't consume you, it returns you to yourself. It doesn't demand that you dim yourself so the other can shine. It happens between two whole presences, not between a presence and a shadow that serves. Directing love with awareness is not being cold. It is being precise. It is recognizing that your energy is a finite and sacred resource, and that investing it in those who despise it is a form of blasphemy against yourself. The right people will appear in your life when you stop emotionally casting for roles no one asked you to fill. And those right people won't demand that you prove anything. They will simply remain, without demanding performance, without demanding sacrifice, without turning your presence into an obligation. You've already heard everything you needed to hear. What comes from now on will be your decision, and yours alone. You can close this video, return to the same circles, fit the mask back on, and keep funding with your soul the inertia of people who will never acknowledge the price you pay. Or you can accept that the illusion is over, that the theater has closed, and that there is a concrete path to rebuild everything from within. The guide is in the first pinned comment. From here on, either you follow who you were, or you begin to become who you truly are. There is no middle ground. Choose.